So I want to come back to the decisions that get made. I'm going to start asking you now to think like a biotech executive and a pharma executive. And this is the thought experiment that I'd like you to do with me together. Imagine that you're an entrepreneur, perhaps a doctor at a hospital here, or maybe a professor in the biology department, and you come up with this really interesting compound that you want to explore. So you set up a biotech company and you hire your postdoc and a few graduate students. You quit your job in order to do this. You're now the CEO of a biotech company. What is your objective? And so I'm going to ask you that in a minute. Think about it. And now I'm going to ask you to switch hats and imagine that you are head of a particular therapeutics unit at a large pharma company. And I'm going to ask you the same question. What are your objectives in that context? Anybody have any thoughts on that or experience? Jack?
I think in the first case, my objective is probably first either to develop this drug to a certain stage that it can get acquired or put in the market, or raise enough money for me to pursue other targets.
Right.
So I really want this candidate work.
Right.
But in the second case, I may have a large portfolio of drug candidates.
Right.
I think my job is to determine which one is the most promising one, and then I want to put my money and resource to.
Right.
Which field?
Very well put. So let me repeat that in case you didn't hear all of it. There are two different perspectives, very different perspectives, in fact. In the first case, you've quit your job. Your entire career is focused on this company. And you've made commitments to your friends and family. They may have invested. And so you really want this to succeed. And success, what that means, is to develop this compound to a point not where it's going to be sold and go into patients and you're going to market the drug. You're a biotech company. What you want to do is to get it to the point where it'll achieve milestones so that you can get it sold to a pharma company, because you're not going to develop this and market the drug yourself. It's very, very difficult. You're just a small biotech startup. So that's your goal. And as Jack said, you want to raise enough money to get you there. And if it turns out that it doesn't work, you're going to use that money to get somewhere else. But your objective is pretty clear. It's survival and demonstration of a particular milestone, whether it's to get it into the clinic, IND, phase 2, or whatever. It's pretty clear. For a large pharma company, it's quite different. You're typically not just focused on one single therapy. You're focused on a variety of things, and your objective is to obviously move things through the pipeline, but you now have the ability to take something all the way to market and into patients and to be able to distribute it. So the risk-reward trade-off is very different. And so getting back to the biotech company, one of the key things that you have to decide when you're about to conduct a clinical trial is how many patients that you're going to enroll. That's going to be determined by two things, as we just said: your treatment effect and the cost. We all know that you're going to be cash constrained as a biotech company. So what do you think you're likely to be when it comes to your confidence level in your particular treatment effect? Are you likely to be overconfident, underconfident, pretty accurate? What do you think? Anybody? Yeah, Neela? Overconfident. In a way, that's almost a requirement for you to be quitting your job and starting a company. You better believe in yourself, because if you don't believe in yourself, nobody else will. So by definition, you're going to be overconfident. Overconfidence already is going to mean that you will typically underpower a trial. That means you'll use less patients. You don't need to use as many patients if you're correct that your treatment effect is really large. But if you are overconfident, that sounds like you may be thinking that the treatment effect is larger than it really is. That means you're going to be choosing fewer patients than you really need to, and that's going to lead to a problem. Now, on the other hand, on the pharma company side, you might expect that the reverse incentives work. You're a part of a large company. It's not your money. Why not spend as much as you can to ensure the greatest likelihood of a success, because that'll help your career And the downside is, well, you'll have to move on and, spend money elsewhere. So the payoffs are asymmetric. I'm not saying one is good or the other is bad. It is what it is. It's the nature of the particular position, the setting, the industry, and the incentives. But what it suggests is that there is a difference in the two business models. And that's where we're going to lead to with the other alternatives we're going to explore today. The fact is that you would expect biotech companies to engage in smaller clinical trials than pharma companies because of these differing incentives. Now, is this true? Well, I'm not sure, but Shou and I, in working with some colleagues from an industry database vendor, we decided to take a look at this by calculating some numbers. So we looked at data for the last 10 years across 14,681 different clinical trials. And we categorized them into biotech companies or pharma companies. And we simply took the ratio of the target accrual size for biotech clinical trials divided by pharma clinical trials. And that ratio is reported in this table. And so for phase 1 clinical trials in oncology, you can see that biotech used about 36% fewer patients than pharma. And that discount is even larger at the phase 1-2 stage and at phase 3, particularly phase 3, because phase 3 is the largest of the studies, so you would imagine that price sensitivity is going to be greatest there. But also, you would expect overconfidence to be greatest there. If you're enrolling patients in a phase 3 clinical trial, that's good news, right? Because it must be the case that you've actually gotten some success in phase 2. So that's why you're doing a phase 3. So in oncology, it certainly seems like that's the case, that biotech uses fewer patients than pharma. For metabolic disorders, it's less of a discount. For autoimmune diseases, it's a little bit more of a discount. About the only situation where there isn't much of a discount is in metabolic disorders in phase 1. That's about the same. But for all of the other cases, it's clear that biotech uses fewer patients. We do not know. We do not know why. This is literally work in progress. I think, Shou, we got the numbers when? Last week? Yeah, so this is just in time reporting to you guys. So we don't know why. In fact, not only do we not know why, but I can see arguments going both ways for how to interpret the numbers. So biotech companies can look at this and say, you know what, this is what we've been telling you all along. Pharma companies are way too wasteful in having these huge clinical trials. Shame on you, pharma companies. Pharma companies can look at this and say, you know what, this is what we've been telling you all the time. Biotech companies, they don't know what they're doing. They're way overconfident. They're using too small a sample. That's why they fail more often than not. So we don't have an interpretation. Maybe that way everybody will like these results because it has something for everybody. But what it suggests is that these two businesses are very different. And later on, you'll be hearing from two speakers that come from those very different perspectives. And you can ask them to weigh in.
One question, but if you sort it somehow by size, doesn't that influence the results of the study? Because the bigger companies normally tend to have more money, on reserve, so they can actually afford to go, a bit safer than maybe the small ones.
Exactly. Yes, that's the point. So that's why I'm saying I'm not putting any kind of a judgmental interpretation on this. I'm simply saying that they're different. They're different. Larger companies either can afford to spend more money or are willing to spend more money. Smaller companies are either constrained or they're overconfident. There's no way we can tell unless we start looking at the outcomes of these results. Now, I'll tell you, we've started looking at that, and this is still very preliminary, but the outcomes, not surprisingly, are that biotech companies, smaller companies, tend to fail more often than larger companies. Now, are you surprised by that? Again, there are two different interpretations. Smaller companies could say that they're actually working on the riskier things. They're working on the more innovative things, and so they're going to fail more often than not. So we don't know exactly how to interpret. We're just documenting the fact that they are different. And because they're different, the business considerations are going to be different in these two different approaches. Madeline, do you have a question?
I don't want to be the dead horse. I was kind of curious about how Genentech and Genzyme, for example, would fit in here, given that they're both owned by pharma companies. But I don't think anybody would dispute that Genentech is a biotech company, or that Genentech is a biotech company.
You're right. We didn't spend very much time trying to categorize them. This was a very rough cut. But you're right that we probably could debate that. For example, Genzyme used to be a biotech company, But since they were acquired by Sanofi, my guess is that they may be behaving more like a pharma company. So it's very hard to actually characterize some of these companies because they go through these management changes because of these acquisitions and combinations. So I'm not sure how to categorize them.
Because there's also the element of like this, the actual science that's happening. And
Yeah.
my understanding of the biotech company is one that uses biological or natural processes to make their products. So
Right.
that means that, yeah, Genentech and Genzyme and probably Biogen are biotech companies. So just kind of.
So yeah, you know, there are different ways of categorizing them, and that used to be how people looked at biotech companies, that they were focusing on biological therapies, large molecule treatments. But I think that's actually a little bit misleading because there are companies now, small startups, that are focusing on small molecule type of therapies. So you can't just look at it that way. So the way that I focus on biotech versus pharma is a couple of different features. One is, you know, how big are they? How early in their life cycle are they? Second, what is their business model? Are they actually looking to market and distribute drugs, or are they really looking to engage in scientific discovery and get into the clinic and somehow cash out before getting FDA approval? And third, how many different products, marketed products, do they have? So most biotech companies will not have any marketed products, or if they do, it's going to be through joint partnerships with Pfizer, J&J, or some of the big pharma companies. Where this gets a little bit complicated is companies that transition from a biotech to pharma. So there aren't that many of them in history, but the ones that we all know about, like Amgen, Gilead, Biogen, are the success stories. They actually transition from doing this very early stage research into developing drugs, marketing, and distributing them. But that's the exception rather than the rule. So when I say biotech company, I'm thinking about smaller companies whose business model is not to market and distribute drugs, but rather to develop compounds or therapies to the point where they can either partner or be acquired by larger drug companies.